Hello everyone, and welcome to a new series discussing fairy tales. You might be asking, why? Snow White and Sleeping Beauty are all kind of boring and kid stuff, right? Well, the original collection of fairy tales, where they all come from, was called Children and Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, better known today as Grimm's Fairy Tales. And it had over 80 stories, and yeah, a lot of them were much like the ones you already know, but there were some spicy ones in there that aren't talked about much today. The first edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales was finished in 1812. The final edition at the time was released in 1857 and had over 200 stories. There's simply too many stories for all of them to get the same coverage as the big ones, and when you consider some stories were even removed in later editions, there's many that people haven't heard. In this series, we're going to be taking a closer look at some fairy tales that you may not have heard of before, but that are still very interesting and worth hearing about. We're going to be starting today with a story that's so odd, it's often puzzled people as to why it was even included in a book of fairy tales in the first place. It's called How the Children Played Slaughter, and there's actually two slightly different versions of it, and we'll cover both. In a city called Franeker located in West Friesland, which is the Netherlands today, it happened that young children aged 5 and 6, both boys and girls, were playing together. They decided that one boy should be the butcher, another should be the cook, and the third should be the pig. Next, they decided that one little girl should play the cook. Another should be the assistant to the cook. The assistant was supposed to catch the blood from the pig in a little basin so that they could make sausages from it. The butcher, as had been agreed, chased after the boy who was playing the pig, pulled him to the ground, and cut his throat with a little knife. The assistant to the cook caught the blood in a little basin. A councillor who happens to be passing by sees the whole miserable spectacle. He dashes off with the butcher, takes him to the house of the mayor, who immediately calls a meeting of all the councillors. They deliberated at length on the matter and had no idea what to do, for they realised it had all been child's play. One of them, a wise old man, ventured the opinion that the chief judge should put a nice red apple in one hand and a guilder, a kind of coin, in the other, and that he call the child in and stretch out both hands to him. If the child took the apple, he would be declared innocent. If he took the guilder, he would be killed. This was done. The child, laughing, reached out for the apple and was therefore not subjected to any kind of punishment. A man once slaughtered a pig while his children were looking on. When they started playing in the afternoon, one said to the other, "You be the little pig and I'll be the butcher." Whereupon he took an open blade and thrust it into his brother's neck. Their mother, who was upstairs in a room bathing the youngest child in a tub, heard the cries of her other child, quickly ran downstairs, and when she saw what had happened, drew the knife out of the child's neck and in a rage thrust it into the heart of the child who had been the butcher. She then rushed back into the house to see what her other child was doing in the tub, but in the meantime, it had drowned. The woman was so horrified that she fell into a state of utter despair, refused to be consoled by the servants, and hanged herself. When her husband returned home from the fields and saw this, he was so distraught that he died shortly after. Alright, so there's a lot of questions there. Why in the first story did the judge hold out a coin and an apple? It was to test the child's level of brain development and how well he understood his actions. As a coin is symbolically more valuable than an apple, if he took it, it would show that his level of brain development was high enough to understand symbols, and thus that killing his friend was wrong. But since he took the apple, it showed that he had a lower level of symbolic thinking and truly didn't understand that he shouldn't have killed his friend. So the next question is, why would a story like this be added to a book of fantastical morality tales for children? We've got to take a look at the origins of fairy tales in general to understand that. Grimm's fairy tales originated from Germany in the early 1800s and was a collection of mostly oral stories that have been passed down for centuries. The word for fairy tale at the time was, and I apologise for butchering this, Märchen, which simply meant a story or a tale. And that word originated from the old High German word for Mari, which meant news. So, fairy tales as a whole originated as news being passed from village to village. And while there was eventually a split between factual news and fables, some still bridged the gap like the story today did. In fact, this story probably happened. The earliest appearance in writing is of the first version of the story, and it showed up in a newspaper in the 1555, over 200 years before the Brothers Grimm were even born. Their mother had even told them this story when they were children themselves. Although this story appeared in the first edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales, due to complaints it was removed from subsequent editions. It's still missing from most modern editions too, and for the same reason. Parents don't really want their children reading a story so violent. But that leads us to a good point though. What would a child get from a story like this? With most fairy tales, the lesson is pretty obvious. Don't wander in the woods alone, don't talk to strangers, don't let your dad remarry. In How Children Played Slaughter though, if a child could understand the story, then they don't need the story to tell them because they already understand it. Which is the point of the story. The real message seems to be for adults not to show their children things they won't understand. It's for this reason that it's been called a fairy tale for adults. How Children Played Slaughter is probably the darkest fairy tale in the collection, because it's so simple and grounded with really no fantasy whatsoever. It's easy to imagine a child doing this without realizing how terrible it is. It feels so out of place surrounded by stories of fairy godmothers, charming princes, and magic spells, but it's unique in that it offers an interesting glimpse into life at the time, perhaps more so than any story in Grimm's fairy tales. We can see people of all times face tough moral quandaries, and showed remarkable intelligence and insight while doing so. And perhaps most relevant for us, it shows that even as adults in the modern age, we can learn a lot from fairy tales. The Grimms created their collection for a lot of reasons, but most importantly to help save precious cultural artifacts on the verge of being lost. Through this, we get a glimpse of a different time, the wants and desires of people long past. Ranging from fantastical tales to what is effectively sensationalist news stories, they show us the hopes, dreams, and nightmares of the past. How Children Played Slaughter was the first fairy tale of this series, because it's quite different in conception to most popular fairy tales, and it allows us to draw a strong connection from the people of today to the people of yesteryear. We honestly haven't changed that much. We still love fantastical stories of magic and romance, we still worry about children getting the wrong idea from what they see, and we still wrestle with tough moral issues. Perhaps through looking back at the past, we can gain a little insight into ourselves. The book I use for readings today and will be using in the future is the Annotated Brothers Grimm Bicentennial Edition. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. In the coming videos, we'll be covering more stories from Grimm's fairy tales, and eventually branch out into stories from other regions and cultures. I've been your host, More They Doog, and thank you very much for watching.